is that the Church of the Brethren, my own tradition, moved solidly into American culture by the time of World War II, and that its main influence by this time was particularly Protestant liberalism. And in moving from the conservative position of the 1880s to that of mainline liberalism, the Church of the Brethren adopted the dominant logic of the country as conscience and citizenship to frame its position on the world. Now, I assume that depending on where you sit within our movements across the Brethren, that one of these is more interesting than the other. Maybe they're not interesting, but infuriating. I'm counting on that as well. But as a scholar within the Church of the Brethren, I've chosen to focus this research and writing on the questions of conscience and citizenship in order to complicate my own community's understanding and practice of our peace witness today. Since I'm in the company of historians, I do want to say that I chose this particular approach because my assumptions about the purpose of historiography and of my positions on historiography in general. I begin each of my classes on the history of Christianity with a discussion of method, and I say that we must distinguish our history from our past. First and foremost, history is the story that we tell about our past. That means that we're constructing a narrative about what happened because we see that something has changed between then and now, or as Rowan Williams phrases it in such a better way, we do history to make sense of our current times and place. I'm telling this particular story because I look at the current moment and realize my own wing of the Brethren movement looks a whole lot more like American Christianity than it does Brethren Christianity. Underlying this sentiment, then, is the question of how we got here. I grew up hearing stories, the great stories of Brethren peacemakers. I sang the songs about Ted Studebaker as a kid going to annual conference in the car. And at age 18, I found myself registering for selective service and putting 2 letters on the corner of my card, CO, knowing all too well that selective service didn't give a rip about what I was writing, and that those 2 letters barely signaled my own conscientious objection to war, but I did it anyways. One funny story was talking to an Air Force recruiter on the phone, and I let him drone for about 15 minutes, and then he said, "What are you beginning to study?" And I said, "Oh, that's interesting, peace studies." He got silent on the phone for a moment. He said, "Where are you going to do that at?" I said, "Well, this little college in Indiana called Manchester College." "Well, why is that? Why did you choose to go there?" It's a Church of the Brethren College. "What's that?" "Historic Peace Church." "Oh, I assume you're a conscientious objector." "Yes, sir, I am." Good luck in school." But as I moved into ministry, and this particularly in denominational leadership, don't put those 2 words together in the paper, I quickly found that most of my church, at least in practice, didn't share that same conviction. In fact, a lot of brethren have not since World War II. And this presentation then is an attempt to pull back the layers in order to understand how it is that came to be. So the brethren have often made their home wherever they found themselves, and for much of our shared history, this has meant that the brethren were on the move. Whether they were persecuted or whether they moved in pursuit of new opportunities, they had to transport their faith to a new context. I think one moment, however, in our national history seems to have been tailor-made for the brethren, and that's the decades following World War I, when public and ecclesiastical opinion aligned with the Brethren witness for peace. See, long after the historic splits of the 1880s and immediately after the carnage and violence of the war to end all wars, the people of the United States had seen war in the industrial age. Mechanized and chemical weapons dramatically increased the speed and the effects of war. Men could now kill men with extraordinary efficiency. Since combat strategy hadn't really adapted to these new technologies, things like the automatic machine gun or the armored tank or the airplane, scores of men were slaughtered or maimed as lines of troops emerged from the trenches. Even President Wilson's grand vision of the United States as a great power for democracy could not overcome the cost of that war. especially in terms of the lives lost, the bodies wounded, and the psyches traumatized. A lot of historians of the Second World War begin their story with the general pacifist sentiment of the American public. And for military historians, public opinion on the war was a significant factor for American unpreparedness at the rise of global conflict in the 30s and 40s. Politically, this meant two things. Congress was unwilling to appropriate funds for a significant standing army. And second, there was a significant emphasis on isolationism on the international stage. The Brethren found themselves easily in agreement with this opinion. See, Dr. Gallup noted in one survey that 90% of the people questioned would serve in the military only if the United States was attacked. Keep that in mind. The experiences of World War II impacted the Brethren in particular. Conscription and the subsequent questions about continued participation caught many of the Brethren groups, unprepared. Wilson's late decision to enter the war after his re-election and the delay in defining non-combatant roles added to the confusion. What's more, the treatment of conscientious objectors, both in military camps and in prisons, pressed Brethren groups to engage the government following the war. 4 of our 5 groups within the Brethren movement created and formed service committees to register their objection to the military service with the government. What this meant in terms of theology and practice obviously differed among the Brethren groups. However, they all chose to be proactive in documenting their opposition through official church statements and presenting those statements to the government. Since the Brethren were in agreement with the wider culture, the task was much easier. Evangelically leaning Brethren found significant agreement with non-Brethren evangelicals in rejecting militarism. And more mainline-oriented groups found their affinities with notable preachers like Harry Emerson Fosdick, who preached frequently and often against the draft and against future wars. For nearly all of America, the Brethren included, World War I was indeed the war to end all wars. That's until December 7th, 1941. And with the attack on Pearl Harbor, public opinion shifted, almost seemingly overnight, if not within a few months. And once again, the Brethren found themselves at odds with the dominant culture. Or did they? Since the divisions of the 19th century, groups within the Brethren movement have identified themselves with a posture taken towards the dominant culture. Right? We've heard this frequently this week. The uses of terms like progressive and conservative are stated not in relation to the political natures of those terms, but in the ways Brethren have approached the values and practices of the wider society. I mean, this makes sense, right? It's reflective of the language used by the Brethren of the time themselves. But by the 1930s, those identifiers are significantly more complicated. What's more, the groups themselves don't explicitly reflect those terms anymore. That's the most notable in terms of my own Church of the Brethren. It's striking to hear it referred to as a conservative part of the Brethren movement. While we've often identified as one of those conservative groups, by the 20th century, the German Baptist Brethren, in 1908, the Church of the Brethren, had adopted many of the positions of the progressive Brethren. What's more, the Church of the Brethren was much more progressive politically after World War I in questions of peace. And as Gary Kokaiser notes in his summary of Brethren groups, the eve of World War II, the Church of the Brethren had shifted from a traditional posture of non-resistance and non-participation to a much more active sense of pacifism. This was due in part to the closer relationship between the Church of the Brethren and more mainline denominations. When mainline pastors began preaching against not just war, but the conditions that make for war, the Church of the Brethren appears to have correlated the underlying liberal theology, Protestant liberalism of those pastors with their own traditional witness for peace. Here we have to name a significant influence within the dominant culture of the time. The early decades of the 20th century were shaped significantly by what we call the liberal fundamentalist divide in American Christianity. These debates had a significant influence on both the Brethren Church and the Church of the Brethren. These middle and progressive Brethren were significantly shaped by the involvement in evangelical and Protestant liberal groups. The formation of the Fellowship of Grace Brethren churches notably included questions of modernism and the so-called fundamentals. In this, we see that the progressive Brethren movement into American culture lent significant affinity to evangelical Christianity. And the Church of the Brethren, on the other hand, leaned to more towards Protestant liberalism of the mainline denominations, particularly the ecumenical movement. The decision to join the Federal Council of Churches in 1942 signaled just how the once conservative Brethren had found affinity with the liberal side of the American church. For my purpose, then, it's necessary to define these different terms to the varying postures of the Brethren in their position to peace and war in the 1940s. For the old German Baptist Brethren and the Dunkirk Brethren Church, their peace testimony was much more traditional. That is to say, postures of non-resistance and non-participation were cornerstones of their approach. And both groups were very clear to the government that their members could not participate in the military, and they also asserted, following Romans 13 and the Two Kingdoms theology, that government could and would wage war. For the Church of the Brethren, however, the optimism of Protestant liberalism had helped shape a much more modern view of pacifism. While the church was opposed to participation in war, they were convinced that not participation did not mean that they should not work to abolish the conditions that make for war. Here, the Church of the Brethren was much less traditional. In fact, they asserted boldly in the 1930s that all war is sin. And as modern people, the church could and should work to eliminate the very possibility for war. The Brethren Church and the Grace Brethren, on the other hand, took parts of both streams in the movement. While non-resistant, these groups echoed the spheres of sovereignty and Two Kingdoms theology of the evangelical movement at the time. Though they rejected participation in combatant roles, they also rejected the optimism of Protestant liberalism, affirming the right of legitimate governments to wage war. Linking these two aspects of Brethren theology, non-resistance and a view on the role of government, they saw serving as soldiers through non-combatant roles as an appropriate form of service. These traditional, liberal, and evangelical postures played out in significant ways as the United States entered World War II. The traditionalists rejected any participation in the military, just as the Brethren had during the Civil War, maintaining non-participation as a condition for membership. The Church of the Brethren maintained non-participation as a key aspect of the peace witness, yet, except for a few cases, did not dismiss members who joined the military. At the same time, the Church of the Brethren blurred the traditional line between church and public square by working with the government and other peace churches to form what we now call, or what they called at the time, civilian public service. The evangelical groups, on the other hand, rejected combatant roles and yet allowed for non-combatant service. And each of these groups understood their positions to be in harmony with the historic beliefs of the Brethren movement as a whole. Yet, these postures to World War II also reveal a complex view of the Brethren in relation to the wider culture of the 1940s. My own tradition, the Church of the Brethren, made probably the more stark statement against war in the 30s, saying that all war is sin. This also was reflected in many ways by the posture of other Protestant liberals of the time. However, the question was put to a test with the invasion of Pearl Harbor in 1941. While many church leaders and pastors had spoken against future wars, the American church in general appears to have made a decisive turn towards realism, if not active support and participation. Though the official pronouncements of the Church of the Brethren remained consistent after the attack, it's well known that the actions of church members painted a very different picture. Though the annual conference had learned from the events of the First World War and made clear that both combatant and non-combatant roles were not in harmony with the church's teaching, the draft-age men of 1941 made a very different decision. In July of 1944, the Church of the Brethren Ministry to Servicemen published a report in the Gospel Messenger stating that 80.5% of eligible men entered military service as combatants. 11%, they said, of young men entered military service non-combatants, or 1AO, while only 8.5% served in civilian public service. Combined, these numbers reflect nearly exactly what Dr. Gallup had earlier surmised. 90% said that they would join the military if the United States was attacked. Thanks to Merlin Shaw and the ministry servicemen, the Church of the Brethren kept detailed records of its members in both military and civilian public service. He did two things to provide a robust record of the Church of the Brethren during war. Shaw corresponded regularly with servicemen. He sent bulletins and church-related materials at regular intervals and maintained regular correspondence with any men who wrote to him. This brought many connections to brethren and non-brethren alike, and files of these letters have recently been sorted and cataloged in the Brethren Historical Archives and Library in Elgin. Second, Scholl continued the survey that he had initially reported on in 1944. He continued it until March of 1945, when he tabulated the responses and aggregated the information related to brethren men in the military and civilian public service. By 1945, 523 out of 1,019 congregations responded to this questionnaire. From those responses, Scholl counted 12,802 men and women in service. Of that total, 86% were listed as regular military, 1A. 5.5% served as 1AO, or non-combatants, objectors but still within the military. And 5.4% were in civilian public service. Extending out those numbers to account for the whole denomination, Scholl estimated that nearly 25,000 Church of the Brethren men were in public and military service. And based on that percentage, nearly 22,000, 91.5%, were enlisted in the military as combatant and non-combatant. 91%. Here we have a striking confluence of two modes of doing history. First, on the institutional perspective, we have the Church of the Brethren that was clearly a peace church. No more stark a pronouncement was made either by the Brethren movement or in the wider church. And yet, from a social history perspective, the Church of the Brethren was barely distinguishable from the wider public. Now, in fairness, Brethren men were about 28 times more likely to choose civilian non-combatant service, non-military service, than their counterparts. But it's still only 5%. To be fair, the stories of Church of the Brethren civilian public service volunteers has dominated the story that we tell of the Church of the Brethren in World War II. Yet this 5% of draft age men, 5 4/10, is certainly the exception. They demonstrated for the church what active non-resistance looks like during times of war, and hopefully spark the imagination for later generation. And again, we have to acknowledge they are exception to the rule in 41. It may be tempting to answer questions posed by this contradiction of our institutional and social histories by saying that the church itself, its structures, never participated in the military system. In the build-up to war, the War Department sought to repopulate its corps of chaplains in each branch of the military. And according to the conventions of war, these men are non-combatants and do not carry weapons, although some do. In order to fill those ranks of the chaplains, the government turned to the denominations of the country themselves to endorse chaplains for service. Following the anti-establishment clause of the First Amendment, the government did not take up the work of training men for chaplaincy. Instead, they required religious bodies to do that. The churches would train theologians and pastors, while the military would make them soldiers. The stance of the Church of the Brethren was pretty clear. They did not endorse non-combatant service and were explicit that that included chaplains. Individual members may have decided to serve in the military, but the set apart and credentialed ministers would not minister to the servicemen as part of the military. This idea has continued throughout the 20th century as questions of military chaplains have surfaced within the Church of the Brethren through their congregations and districts. This kind of response, while noble, is not true. And as I began to research this paper, I thought of the various positions that our groups have taken related to non-combatants, and specifically chaplains, would be an interesting look at our involvement with culture. It was striking then to read in the Brethren Encyclopedia, since we are here, I should quote it in full. So it was quite a shock to read in the entry under military chaplains this phrase, these two couple sentences. In 1938, the annual conference, Church of the Brethren, decided that the military chaplaincy is inconsistent with the peace witness and is an unacceptable form of alternative service. One Church of the Brethren minister served as an Army chaplain from 1943 to 1973, active duty 43 to 47. The War Department accepted the endorsement by annual conference moderators in lieu of denominational endorsement. Here again, the institutional and social narratives differ significantly. Through official statements, annual conference, the highest authority of the Church of the Brethren on matters of faith and practice, rejected military service, all military service. Yet not only did brethren men serve as combatant and non-combatants, but annual conference moderators had affirmed the ministerial credentials of a military chaplain. That chaplain was Elmer Hoover. Hoover was a minister of the Carson Valley congregation in Duncansville, Pennsylvania. He completed his Bachelor of Science in Education at Juniata and a Master's of Education at Penn State. And while a history teacher, he was called into a team of three ministers in 1937. In November of 42, Hoover began correspondence with the Office of Chaplains in the War Department. That first letter was short, a simple request for qualifications. In early 43, however, Hoover began his quest in earnest, writing regularly to inquire about his application, make sure his file was complete, and to plead his case to join the Army. In 1943, Hoover received his commission as a first lieutenant in the Corps of Chaplains and reported to the chaplain school at Harvard University for the 4-week training. After that month in Massachusetts, he was mustered into the replacement pool, awaiting assignment. And at first he was placed stateside in Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, with a tank destroyer battalion. By the end of October 1943, he was reassigned to the 313th Medical Battalion of the 88th Infantry Regiment. The first troops of the 88th, including Hoover and the 313th Medical Battalion, crossed the Atlantic for war. They crossed in November 1943. The 88th was in combat with some time in reserve positions for most of 1944. And during that time, Hoover was transferred within the regiment to the 351st Infantry Division and was promoted to the rank of captain in June of 44. On October 11th, 1944, Hoover was in the command post for the 351st in the mountains of Italy when Allied planes fired on the post. 4 men were killed in the attack along with 14 wounded. In the chaos of the moment, Chaplain Hoover gathered as many white bed sheets as he could find, ran out and signaled the pilots, and he spelled out U.S. on the ground, and the planes broke off their attack. But in the confusion, German soldiers began to figure out what was going on and fired on the post. And under fire, unarmed, Hoover returned to the post and orchestrated the removal of the dead and wounded. He was awarded the Bronze Star, and his deeds were recorded in the unit history published after the war. For nearly 18 months, Hoover was wounded twice, so he carried a Purple Heart with clusters and witnessed the death of his own assistant. Surely Hoover had ministered to many of those 10,000 men wounded or killed out of the 88th. And Hoover returned to the United States, taught education at Elizabethtown College, and remained a chaplain in the National Guard until 1973, and retired at the rank of colonel. How is it that a minister from the Church of the Brethren that had stated military chaplaincy was not an appropriate form of alternative service would serve as a chaplain in the U.S. Army? and not just serve as a non-combatant, he did so with distinction. Two collections help illuminate this story, often overlooked in our institutional histories of the Church of the Brethren. First, Hoover's correspondence with the War Department as part of his military chaplain file maintained at the National Archives. And second, Hoover and Merlin Scholl maintained significant contact in 43 to 46. In the first collection of letters, Hoover pressed hard to be considered for the chaplaincy. First, he asked about requirements. Then he was told he was rejected based on the quota system. Obviously, the War Department recognized they weren't going to have many brethren chaplains. And Hoover pleaded his case, and his initial argument was purely subjective. He simply wanted to be a part of the effort. It would be an honor to serve, he said. Once he realized the quota system was built on the assumptions about brethren participation in war, Hoover described how so many brethren men had joined the armed forces. And even if they were a minority group among the population, they deserved a chaplain in their tradition. And in the final letters before his acceptance, Hoover noted twice that the brethren are shifting their views. To support this statement, I laugh out loud. To support this statement, he referenced specifically the 1942 decision by Annual Conference to join the Federal Council of Churches. Itself, the FCC, had been a conduit for endorsement of military chaplains. In fact, after World War I, they had given some 1,600 medals to the chaplains of all Protestant traditions. Here it's worth noting Hoover's three main arguments. The first is purely subjective, and that when the office of chaplains asked if he could swear the oath of commission, could he do it and support the efforts of the armed men with a good conscience? And he said yes. And in fact, he used the vocabulary conscience often. And that conscience language was common to both the War Department, Hoover, and the church. Second, he appealed to the significant numbers of brethren men already in military service. And he was doing this not from the Elgin offices where he was tracking that, but from his own experience in the local community. To support that, he referred to another brethren pastor locally whose son had been in the Navy and died aboard the ship in the Atlantic. That same pastor then provided a letter of reference on Hoover's behalf. Here, Hoover appealed to both the reality of being in the military age and not joining the war effort. He felt both self-criticism and the social implications of not serving. In one letter, he commented that he feared a loss of standing and influence in his community if he were not to make the same sacrifice. And then finally, Hoover acknowledged the peace position of the denomination, and yet interpreted both the numbers of men in service and the recent decisions of the church as support for his assertion that the denomination was moving towards support of the war. I think, to be sure, a few of the brethren leaders at the time interpreted the statistics and the FCC ecumenical movement decision in the same light. Dernbaum notes that M.R. Ziegler and others championed the cause of joining the Federal Council by noting its strong pacifist leanings, particularly in the interwar years. They also failed to acknowledge that it hosted the Commission on Military Chaplains at the same time. Given the significant effort by church leaders to influence draft legislation in 1940 and the establishment of CPS, the view of denominational leaders such as Rufus D. Bowman, Paul H. Bowman, Dan West, and M.R. Ziegler was exactly the opposite of the conclusion that Hoover had come to. Ecumenical cooperation, both with other peace church traditions and the Federal Council, was an opportunity to work constructively for peace. The FCC submitted a statement supporting the conscientious objection of its member denominations and even sent representation to address the House Committee on Military Affairs. However, the FCC also facilitated the endorsement of chaplains for its constituent members. In order for Hoover to be commissioned, the War Department said they needed a letter of approval from the church moderator. And though Hoover had submitted letters of affirmation from local and district leaders, the War Department was clear that that moderator letter was essential. That endorsement fell to Paul H. Bowman, the same man who addressed Congress in hearings on proposed legislation for the draft and had worked as part of the Service Commission to form civilian public service. Though Bowman's letter isn't contained in either the chaplain file or in the letters in Elgin, it's evident from later correspondence that Bowman and others had stated that Hoover was indeed a minister and a member of the church, but that such a statement should not be considered an official endorsement, although the War Department considered it an official endorsement. The letters between Hoover and Scholl offer another view on the war, albeit a view from the denomination's own internal debates. In these letters, Hoover's much more personal, much more confessional about his views on war and serving in the military. Initially, he simply wrote to inquire, is there another brethren chaplain out there? In one instance, he appears rather frustrated that a sermon he had submitted for publication in the Gospel Messenger had not been published. In fact, he clearly felt like his church was ignoring his service. The initial letter is not contained in the files. That initial letter about his sermon isn't contained in the files. However, it appears to have been shared with Scholl, who wrote to Hoover that the publication schedule often takes a long time. Scholl also commented that he was concerned that Hoover had not acknowledged their own correspondence back and forth, and that Scholl was indeed writing on behalf of the denomination. Hoover quickly replied, saying he wasn't angry, but that only his feelings had been hurt, and that he did indeed remember his correspondence with Scholl. Scholl's letters to Hoover stand in stark contrast to all of his other correspondence that are in the files. His other letters are short and they're formal in tone, but his letters to Hoover often span 2 or more pages. And at one point, Scholl addresses Hoover by his first name, since clearly they had grown in familiarity with each other. The two exchange both their convictions and reservations about the war, with Scholl noting that he can't find fault with the conscience of men like Hoover who choose to serve. He says, this is Scholl, while I have always classed myself as a pacifist, I suppose that I would have to admit that I don't carry my pacifism as far as a good many in the church do, or as far as some who would like to see it. For instance, I believe that though I could not have a part in the destructive side of the war effort, still I feel that it is much better for the future of mankind that the Allies should win this struggle in the Axis. Unlike the traditional groups of the Brethren movement, the Church of the Brethren made much more room for individual conscience. In some instances, even more traditional congregations within the Church of the Brethren disfellowshipped men who enlisted, but welcomed them back upon return with meetings with elders and ministers and a confession of sin in front of the church. Even official statements by the denomination encouraged congregations to welcome home both veterans and civilian servicemen with the same joy and encouragement. However, Dernbaugh notes in Fruit of the Vine one CPS serviceman who came back. This serviceman said, when we went to CPS camp, we were prepared to face an unfriendly community, but we were unprepared for the number of men in our own church who would no longer support our position. This particular study of Chaplain Elmer Hoover provides an interesting look into the church's response to the culture through the intersection of institutional and social histories. Though significant questions remain to be explored, it does reveal that the same logic of conscience and citizenship fueled the institutional efforts and the decisions made by draft-eligible men. Brethren leaders, men in CPS, and military servicemen all asserted, through word and deed, that they were upstanding, good American citizens. Even the famed Goshen Statement, World War I, and the subsequent responses stated plainly that though brethren rejected war in all forms, they are productive members of American society. CPS itself was predicated on the desire to both reject war and contribute to the needs of the country. Those brethren who joined the military as combatants and non-combatants asserted the same argument with their actions. Even if war is a sin, they seem to say, this particular war asked something different. Like the wider population, brethren stood by their convictions about peace, but once the war came to American soil, circumstances dictated a different conclusion. Whatever the understanding of war in general, or the war, or this war in particular, Church of the Brethren men strove to prove the quality of their character as Americans. One caveat here is that historians are often tempted to tell the story of the past with the outcome already decided. World War II is often a case study for that kind of evaluation by hindsight. While we can look back at the liberation of concentration camps and argue the just cause of the war, Hoover, Shaw, and Bowman were living towards that conclusion. Their statements and letters from 40 to 43 did not contain the concerns about the treatment of Jews or the arguments for the country to begin accepting refugees. None of that is there. Though Hoover did ask what would happen to the freedom of worship if men chose not to fight after Pearl Harbor, there is no reference in his letter to the concerns we now associate with the war. Even as late as 1945, when Rufus D. Bowman published his study guide 70 times 7, there is no reference made to the Holocaust or the treatment of the Jews. Rather, he addressed the Hitler question that we all get in more general terms about the conditions that made Hitler possible. And even then, Bowman asserted that nonviolent resistance was the best option. I think only Scholl seems to hint at the conditions coming to public awareness late in the war as he had articulated that preference about Allied victory. Rather, the desire to be good American citizens was woven throughout the letters and statements. The once conservative wing of the Church of the Brethren stepped fully into the dominant culture in its work for governmental recognition of conscientious objectors. Brother Lee learned an important lesson after World War I and the Goshen Statement, and in the years between wars, as new legislation was being proposed, Church of the Brethren leaders worked tirelessly to secure the exemption for objectors. Paul H. Bowman tried to impress this on the legislatures when he said, "They exercise their right of suffrage," he said, "and approve the holding of public office where the principles of love and nonviolence are not violated. The brethren," he continued, "pay their taxes, they obey the laws of the land as citizens, they lay little burden on the government for settling disputes, and they build stable homes and foster permanent family ties in harmony with the best of American traditions." The primary sources also show how conscience figured prominently in the reasoning of Hoover denomination leaders in the War Department. Bowman addressed the government urging clear exemptions for religious conscience, just as Hoover was beginning to examine his own conscience about wanting to be recognized by both the government and his church. And the church's pastoral function often coached the congregations that conscience lay just beneath the surface as they were urged to embrace returning military and public servicemen. Bowman, in his study on the peace position of the church and his later study resource, was clear that the fault of the church was not in its position, but simply that we had not taught it. Here it's evident that Bowman assumed conscience could be directed through solid teaching by the church and her ministers. The problem, of course, is that conscience is a morally neutral term. While appeals to conscience all function differently, the question always is begged, at what is the conscience pointed? And rather than interrogate how that conscience arrives to its conclusions, we are more often set in a process of documenting a person's sincerity in their conscience. Right? C.O. Boers do this. They ask for letters from others and references, and Hoover provided a similar thing to show the verification, to document of their genuineness and sincerity in their conscience objection. Hoover and others were the first generation of brethren fully Church of the Brethren, stepping into the workings of the world. They were fully in the mainstream. They were finding their theological way in new territory, and the commonalities they could find with the dominant culture were in these categories of conscience and citizenship. This story about the past, of course, raises theological questions. However, obviously I'll take the historian's way out and say that's beyond the scope of this paper. At the same time, the assertion of conscience and citizenship figures so prominently in the moral reasoning of the church that we gain a better understanding of how the Church of the Brethren has reached this moment in time These two values of sincere conscience and citizenship show how much of our theological and ethical reasoning is shaped by the dominant culture. And many of our current debates and questions still revolve around those two terms. The peace witness of the Church of the Brethren still finds itself wrapped in questions of conscience and civic duty. And the concern about the Church of the Brethren's peace witness, so clearly stated in Ruth this Bowman's study, still occupies the mind of many church leaders. Now that we are truly at home